Well, if that's a Clemhurst knot, then what's a slippery hitch? Oh, hello. Tonight's episode is for those of you who are bored with breadsticks, bread loaves, and bread muffins, and are looking for a more exciting bread. Yes, tonight, we're making pretzels. Now, it should be noted that the seemingly innocent pretzel has a rather dark history. According to a medieval European legend, in a land ruled by a tyrannical sorcerer king, there lived a man named Johannes Presselman. Johannes was a baker, whose breads and pastries were renowned the world over. One day a messenger was sent to his house by the sorcerer king, to ask Johannes to provide an extravagant cake for the sorcerer king's birthday, as well as bread for the banquet. Fearing the king's wrath, and always cherishing an opportunity to create something extravagant, Johannes of course agreed. Unfortunately, in his enthusiasm, among the many decorations he applied to the cake were raisins. The sorcerer king hated raisins. Upon seeing the cake, he demanded that Johannes provide a fresh one on the spot. Johannes crossed his arms defiantly and refused. The sorcerer king flew into a rage, and turned the baker's blood to boiling water, his bones to flour, and his skin to salt. He was served at that very banquet, and by all accounts he was delicious. Thus was born the Johannes Presselman, or as we know it today, the pretzel. The sorcerer king now owns a chain of bakeries in Pennsylvania, and most pretzels these days are not transmogrified transgressors, so pretzels can be eaten with a minimum of guilt. They're even easy to make in your own home. I'll show you how. You only need a few basic ingredients for pretzels, but you have many additional options. You can sweeten them with molasses, sorghum, brown sugar, white sugar, or honey. You can use white flour or whole wheat. You will need yeast and salt. Today I'm using Parmesan cheese, garlic, and onions. Mince the garlic finely by crushing each clove with the flat of a blade and then chopping well. To make the dough, you'll need warm water, about 110 to 115 degrees. If you don't have a thermometer, just go with slightly warmer than body temperature. To 2 cups of water, add about a tablespoon of yeast or 1 packet. For sweetener today, I'm going to use sorghum. It'll complement both the onions and the cinnamon in the 2 kinds of pretzels we're making today. If I didn't have sorghum, I'd probably use honey, brown sugar, or a combination of molasses and white sugar. Stir the sorghum and the yeast until both are dissolved in the water. Add about 2 teaspoons of salt, or up to a tablespoon. Stir until the salt is dissolved as well, and let it sit for a few minutes. If the yeast is working, you'll have this nice foamy cream on top. Add about a cup of flour at a time to the bowl. My 1 cup measure broke, so I'm using my half cup measure to scoop. It's difficult to give an exact measurement of flour for any bread recipe. The variables include humidity, temperature, and the way you yourself work the dough, so just keep adding a cup at a time and stirring it in until you have a sticky dough. Since I'm making 2 types of pretzels today, when the dough is still in a pourable form, I'm going to split it between 2 bowls. I'm going to continue adding all-purpose white flour to the first bowl, but to the second bowl, I'm going to add whole wheat flour. The same rules for mixing and kneading generally apply to both. From this point, continue adding flour and mixing until you have a stiff dough that's just barely too sticky to be handled with your bare hands. If you don't have a wooden spoon, you can use practically anything else, even your bare hands, which I do sometimes. If the dough becomes too dry or you add too much flour by accident, you can always add a little bit more water. While the first dough is still fairly wet, I'm going to add some of the garlic to it. I'm also going to cut some of the onion into it. I'll show you how I do this, but it's not the safest method. I cut the onion across the top 3 times, about an inch deep. I then give it about a quarter turn, and do the same thing. I then slice the onion over the bowl. It's easy to cut yourself this way, so I suggest dicing it on a cutting board or in a food processor. You want to have fairly small pieces of onion, as the larger they are, the more difficult the pretzels will be to roll out. Stir the dough well to incorporate the garlic and the onions. To the second dough, I'm going to add cinnamon and sugar. The sorghum is sufficient for the first dough, but I want these to be a little sweeter. Stir that as well, and as I said before, keep adding flour and stirring until you have a plump dough that can be kneaded without sticking to lightly floured hands. Once the dough is of that quality, sprinkle some flour onto a clean, flat, dry surface. Add the dough, put some flour on the palms of your hands, and knead the dough. There are many methods of kneading. You can use whatever method works best for you, but I do it this way. I press my right palm into the dough, flattening and stretching it. Then I give it a quarter turn and do the same thing, working in more flour as I go, and adding more as needed if the dough becomes too sticky. Continue working with the dough until it becomes nice and elastic. This could take from 5 to 10 minutes. When you are done kneading the dough, it should still be willing to stick to itself, but not as much to the kneading surface or to your hands. As you work with the dough and develop the gluten strands, it will start to resist your kneading. Form the dough into a ball. One way to check and see if it's been kneaded enough is to poke it. If it springs back, it's good. Get out the olive oil and pour a little bit into a bowl. Spread it around and plop the dough in. Make sure the dough is coated well with the olive oil. This will keep the surface from drying out and cracking as it rises. Cover it with a towel or plastic wrap and set it aside. If you don't have a scraper, you can use the back end of a knife to clean off the cutting board. I'm going to do this now because we're working with 2 different flavors of pretzel. The second dough should be worked in pretty much the same method as the first. The inclusion of whole wheat flour in this one might make it a little stickier and slightly less elastic, but there shouldn't be a huge difference. When you are done working the second dough, form it into a ball as well and give it the poke test. For this one, we'll use vegetable oil. Put the dough in the bowl and coat it in the same manner. Cover it and set it aside. Let the doughs rise until they're about doubled in bulk, or until after the intermission.
Good evening. It's intermission time, and during the next 10 minutes, we invite you to visit our refreshment stand located in the center of the drive-in.